Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in EDH. Today we're looking at Edric, Spymaster of Trest, and this one's going to be pretty straightforward. So Edric is a 3-mana Simic commander, he's a 2-2, and he says whenever a creature deals combat damage to one of your opponents, its controller may draw a card. So while this does allow our opponents to attack each other to draw cards, mostly Edric is going to be more beneficial for us, and we're going to build our deck around having a bunch of cheap creatures with evasion so that we can attack and draw cards. And that is going to be paired up with a bunch of extra turn spells, with the idea being that we will attack our opponents with all of our cheap evaders, draw a bunch of cards. At least one of those will be an extra turn spell. We'll cast that extra turn spell, go to the next turn, attack all of our opponents with all of our creatures, and eventually win through beatdown. So obviously we have a bunch of cheap evasion creatures, usually with some sort of other ability tacked on that makes them somewhat useful. So things like Fairy Seer or Silver Raven as ways of scrying, Mausoleum Wanderer as a tax effect, Spyglass Siren, Siren Storm Tamer for protection, Spectral Sailor, just a bunch of cheap evasion creatures that we can hit our opponents. However, we also, of course, have a bunch of our ramp creatures, Elvish Mystic, Delighted Halfling, etc., which also double up as ways of attacking our opponents to draw more cards. Usually, one of our opponents at the least will not have a blocker, and so we can just attack them and draw cards via our Mana Dorks, which makes them much more useful than they would normally be. Aside from that, once we do have a bunch of creatures, if for some reason that's not sufficient to kill our opponents, we do have a Craterhoof Behemoth that we can use to just end the game quickly. Bunch of card draw. Usual suspects, things like Rhystic Study and Mystic Remora, but whatever cheap creatures we can grab are better than they would normally be, so things like Fairy Mastermind, Polywog, Prodigy. We do have cards like Grazilax and Tusky as basically secondary versions of Edric. Like, they're not exactly Edric, but they're kind of the same thing, so if Edric dies and we can't pay the tax, these are just additional ways of having another Edric effect. Skull Clamp, obviously, we have a ton of cheap creatures with 1 toughness, so this is going to be another way that we can draw a bunch of cards. We do have Hullbreaker Horror as a way to potentially generate infinite mana by looping mana rocks, so something like Sol Ring plus Mana Crypt. However, this in itself isn't a way to win the game, but it is a way to stabilize the game. So if we ever get into a point where we are, of course, drawing a bunch of cards with Edric, and then we have a Hullbreaker Horror in play, it's going to be very difficult for our opponents to actually resolve anything to stop us. And the reason that we don't have a typical combo card like, say, Thassa's Oracle here is because we don't really need it. We can just win through beatdown. Bunch of counter spells, pretty straightforward here. And then we've got our extra turn spells. This isn't every extra turn spell, but it's the ones I consider to be the best, which it mostly means the ones that are the cheapest. There really isn't much to say about any of these. It's basically just the best extra turn spells that you can get your hands on. If for whatever reason you don't consider 9 to be enough, you can obviously include more, but there is a balance to be met in terms of potentially drawing extra turn spells, especially in our opening hand when we may not necessarily want them yet. So we don't necessarily want a ton of them. Bit of fast mana, obviously the faster we can get Edric down, the better. Pretty straightforward lands, nothing much to say here other than that Dryad Arbor is technically a creature that we can attack with, and that Gaia's Cradle and to a lesser extent Nykthos are going to be ways of generating a lot of mana based on all of the creatures that we are playing. Various forms of protection, again usually in the form of creatures if possible, so things like Hope of Ghirapur, Storm Tamer, Allosaurus Shepherd, etc. All of our ramp spells, a little bit of removal, Force of Vigor, Karn's Temporal Sundering, technically a removal spell, Rex Sage. Collector Oof as our 1 stacks piece. It's notable that we have GSZ and Natural Order as ways of tutoring for creatures, so do keep in mind that creatures to tutor for should fall into being green to accommodate these, which is why we're playing for Collector Oof as an example. And Crop Rotation is primarily a way to go grab Gaia's Cradle. And then finally, Druid's Repository. Whenever a creature you control attacks, put a charge counter on Druid's Repository. Remove a charge counter from it to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, so it turns our attacks into not just card draw from Edric, but into additional mana from the repository. But with that said, that is going to be Edric, Spymaster of Trest in EDH.